Yeah, hi there and welcome back. So let us continue. And in this lecture, we are going to learn about the parameters in the dart function. And we'll be learning about the positional and the named as well as optional and the required parameters in our function. And on the previous lecture, we have learned about the basic about the function and the return type and the nested functions and all of those stuff. And if you haven't watched the previous videos, just go and watch it because we will be directly moving on creating a function over here. So I'm not going to explain the basic about the functions. So what we'll do is we'll go and create our first function over here, and I'll just create a void function because we are not going to return anything from here. And I'll just say cal a and b. So let's say a and b, and this will take some parameters. So first is an int a and double. Let's say a double of a b. So let it do UPL double of the b. And let's take another one as a string of our name. So we have three parameter, and this is basically a positional parameter. Why this is a positional parameter? Because when you have to call this function call n and b, we have to make sure we pass in the argument on the correct position. So this is a string, this is a double, and the integer. So we need to make sure that we pass the correct arguments on the correct order. So if you pass a string over here, that's going to give us an error. If you pass a let's say double over here, and here you pass a int, and that will give you an error because we have to make sure that we pass the arguments on the correct order. So that's why we call it as a positional parameters. So here we will change this one to 10, and here we will just call it as a Richard. So we got that one, and that will remove our error. So this is how we call our we call it as a positional parameters, because we have to pass in the arguments on the correct order. And here you can just go and print out, and you can print out the like a name, right? And then if you want to do something for this a and b variable, you can just create a var of a c and just go and calculate the a plus a b. So that's up to you. So I just want to show you what is a positional parameter, and how you can create a function that will take some parameters, and when you call that function we have to pass the argument. Just make sure that when you call that function we have to pass the argument, and when you create a function that is as a parameter. And let's take a look about the name parameters over here. So this is quite confusing if you have let's say a 5 parameter, 10 parameters that you are taking in. So that will be quite confusing, that what is the name, and that you will get confused, because if you have a very long parameter that is required, so you have to know that what is the type, and it will be more easier to name it as by the by the name. So what we will do is we will create a one function, and we'll call it as a void over here. And so let's say cal a, b, and c, and here we will pass this as a int, right? And you can call as a x, and width, sorry, not the width, we need to pass a double and y, right? And here we again pass it as a string type, and I'll just call it as a name too. And here we will pass it as another one boolean, and that's it. There's each true. So we have 4 parameters over here. And now what we can do is, if we want to call this one, we still have to, this is actually a positional parameter. So how we can convert this one to a named parameter is we need to pass this one inside a curly brace. So I'll pass that one inside the curly brace, and let me arrange it in a column or the horizontal. So okay, so now when I put a curly brace over here inside this particular brace over here, it will give you an error because it says that the parameter x can't have a null value. So what we need to do is, when we say this one as a name parameter, it will also become as a optional parameter, so the user don't have to actually pass it. So what we have to do is we have to make it as a nullable. Sorry, not here. So we have to make it as a nullable. Just put a question mark over here, and sorry, it should be here. Yeah. So now you can just go and make it this one too as a nullable. And what we have to do is now here, if you want to go and do some of this stuff, you can just go and print the name, right? So we have a name and all that stuff, you can do it. But I want to show you how we can call that function. So call A, B, and C. Now when we call that function, we can pass the type or the name. So I'll just say X, and X is of the type of int. I'll just pass as a 10, and we have another one, let's say of one name. I just want to pass in the name, and name I'll just pass in as a Richard, and then I will pass in the Y over here, and then Y I need to pass in as a double, so 5.0, right? And then I can close it. So now you can see that I don't have to be precise over here on what position I have to pass in the parameter. You can see that I can pass in any order, right? I just have to name it. So this is really useful, and the code is very readable, right? So you can name the arguments over here directly and pass in the value. So this is a good thing, and also your code is much more readable than this one, right? So when you call, you don't know what is actually you're passing over here for, what type of the arguments or what is actually doing, so you don't know, right? So this is a better way of doing, and yeah, and that should be if you have very long requirement of the parameters, and then you should always use as the named parameter, which is also by default a optional parameter. And what we'll do now is I'll just copy the same function from here, and let us see how we can create the optional parameters on the positional parameter. So optional and the positional parameter at the same function. So I'll just call it as a C and AV, and you have a C and a D. So here I will also take in one more parameters, and that parameter will be of a type of the string and will be of a last name. So we have another, I have added this one, and if this is a name or the positional, sorry, this is a positional parameters, right? So how we can make the argument or the parameter as optional. So let's say I want to make this one as optional, so I have to put it inside this particular bracket over here, and then when you put it as optional, you have to make it as a nullable. If you don't want to make it as a nullable, and you have to give a default value. So what I'll do is I'll just remove that too, and let's say I will make this too as a optional. And make sure that when you are creating an optional parameter, it should be always at the, you should always place it as a end. And what we'll do is I'll just make it as a nullable, and for this one I will just not make it as a nullable, but I can make it as a default value over here, and default value I'll just give it as a day1. So whenever we pass in, if you don't pass in this one, it will have a default value of day1. So this will also be as a positional parameter as well as the optional parameter. So I'll just copy this one and paste it over here, positional and the optional parameters. When you are creating optional parameter together with the positional parameter, then you have to make sure you have to pass it always at the end. You cannot move this one to the front over here. Sorry, if you want to move it over here, and that will probably give you an error over here. So you cannot do that one. So make sure that your optional parameter is always at the end when you are creating a positional and the optional parameter. So now if I want to call that function, if I go over here and if I call as a call abcd, right, and now you can see that only the two parameters or the two arguments that we have passing and both of these are optional. So here I can just pass it as a 10, and here I can just pass it as a 20, and if I want I can just pass in another one, right? And if I want I can pass the string name, and I can just call it as a Richard. And if you don't want to pass in, then you can just remove it, then it is still a nullable type. So that is another way that we can actually use this one. And let's go and create another one. We have a required parameters. So what I'll do is I think I'll just copy the same function and pass it over here, and I'll just call it ABCDE. So that's the very pretty bad function name, right? But just for the test and learning purpose it should be fine. But when you are actually creating a function for your actual application, you should never name all this really confusing and not a good practice to create a function name with all of those random character. So what we want to do now is we want to have a request. So this function is basically optional, so we don't have to actually pass in, right? So if I go and call that function, call ABCDE, and I can just call that function without passing any parameters or without passing any arguments over here. It's perfectly fine and it doesn't give us any error. But what about if you have some requirement that you must pass in some parameters in order to function this function correctly, right? So if you have this function and it needs to work correctly, then you need to pass in some parameters. So for that, what we can do is I'll just put it on the column wise over here. And now what we can do is we can actually set this one as a required. So let's say I want to set int or x as a required. So now which means that I have to pass in that particular x, right? So I can just call name x and I'll just pass the value. So only I have to pass in the x, and others I don't have to pass in. And let's say I have to pass in this particular bool variable, so I'll just call it as a required. And now if I go over here, I have to call that one, right? What is the name of that one? Is true, right? Is true, and I'll call it as a false over here. So you can see that you have a required, so which means that this one and this one is required, and these are two as an option. So required as well as the optional parameters is over here. So I can also just copy this optional param, required params, and the optional params. So this is required and this is required, and these two are the optional. So this is how we create a function that is also unnamed, right? So this one particularly has all of those. So this one has a named parameter, right? Name parameter as well as the optional. Sorry, this is not a position. This should be optional. So we have the named, right? So named parameter, as well as we have the required parameters, as well as the optional parameters. So this function has all of the stuff that we require: optional and named, right? And as well as the required. So I hope you learned something over here, and I hope you understand about all of the parameters that we can create using a function in the Flutter Dart.